As we've sort of been indicated already, the times of the 1930s for Archbishop Mowll weren't that easy. If you think about the election and then some of the issues that occurred in the 1930s, it was quite tough for him. And it's interesting, when I had a look at Marcus Lone's biography of Mowll, he wrote this about the war years. He said that the outbreak of war allowed Mowll's strength and abilities to be utilised, and such were his efforts that during the war period, Lone believed that this established Mowll as a great diocesan bishop. And when you go to Sydney Anglicans and Cable and Judd, they say much the same thing. They say that his energetic response to the demanding situations was best seen in those war years. And I think as I've looked through the materials in the war years, I think that's probably a very good judgment. We see Mowll at his best in these years. We see the energy, the capacity, his ability to organise, and also his ability to inspire. And yet at the same time, we see the things which are dear to his heart. And that's what I'm going to try and pick up through this talk this afternoon. Like most people in Australia, he watched with concern in the late 1930s the events in Europe. And he penned his thoughts in a number of pastoral letters in the Diocesan magazine. He said this in October 1939 after the outbreak: "Up to the last minute, our hopes and prayers would be that war would be averted. England laboured much and risked much for peace. When the history of this last few years is written, the verdict on that point will be unequivocal. Unless this evil thing which is now threatening civilisation is stamped out, freedom and security can never be guaranteed." The next year he wrote this, and there is some teeth in what he's saying, because what he saw was the totalitarian states, and he wanted to argue that the war was not only justified but necessary. And it's interesting, when I compare him with Archbishop Wright in the First World War, Mowll didn't talk so much about duty. What he talked about was the rightness of the cause, and that in itself would encourage people to actually volunteer. He didn't need to get on a platform about duty. But this is what he said in April 1940: "Our virtues are Hitler's vices, and our vices are his most prized virtues. Kindliness, tolerance, justice, truth, those individual liberties so hardly won and so dearly prized, to him are objects of contempt and pity. His standards are set against ours. It is a struggle between right, as God gives us to see the right, and wrong. The Christian religion makes it impossible for us on any terms to accept the Nazi conception of life." Well, they're fighting words, and he's making it very clear how he sees the reaction to war. And when the war broke out, he made it clear what was going to be his attitude in terms of the diocese's response. He said, "As Christians, we pray for the victory of the right and the establishment of peace among the nations, and side by side with this will be the call to prayer as well as the call to work." Prayer and supportive ministry activity were to become the watchwords for his years during the Second World War. And we emphasise that because we'll often tend to look at the things that he did rather than what drove him. And he was a man of much prayer. So he moved quickly to ensure there were regular times of prayer about the war throughout the diocese. For him, he said prayer was the primary duty of the clergy and indeed of all Christian people, especially at this time of national emergency. And so a special form of service was devised in September 1939 and distributed widely to the parishes, and daily services of prayer were arranged at the cathedral. Remember, he had no dean at the time, so he was very heavily involved in terms of the cathedral's ministry. And this is the ministry that went on at the cathedral right from the outset. There were daily prayer services, 12 to 2 p.m, Monday to Thursday each week, focused particularly on what he called war witness. Then Monday in each week, prayer by name of the men of the fighting forces in the parishes. So the parishes had to forward the names, and these men would then be prayed for. And there was a special commemoration of the men fighting at sung evening prayer. Every Tuesday at 3:30, the cathedral would pray for the 6th Division, Wednesday the 7th Division, Thursday the 8th Division, Friday the 9th Division. And Friday of each week there was a day of continuous intercession. And from the 1st of April, he said that the cathedral bell would be rung for a minute each day at noon. His reasoning was simple: I'm asking that all who hear it will pause to pray, I suggest that this should also be done in all of our parishes. Not only was he keen in terms of getting prayer within the diocese, he also was involved ecumenically with the other denominations. And there are numerous times when you can find ecumenical services or joint prayer services that were held. As well as that, he set aside times for prayer when there were times of triumph as well as tragedy. And so in January 1941, he noted in his pastoral letter in the Diocesan magazine, the past month will stand out in Australian history for the victory of the Second AOF at Bardia. This magnificent achievement, which removed the threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal, was celebrated at a Thanksgiving service in the cathedral. Later that year, with the loss of the Sydney off the West Australian coast with all hands lost, he wrote about how there was a service in the cathedral. He went on to talk about how he was shocked at what had happened, his sympathy to those who were bereaved, but how when he called a service together, the cathedral was overcrowded so that people had to wait outside. And once Japan entered the war on the side of the Axis cause, and particularly the 8th Division men were taken into captivity, he organised regular times of prayer for these people. And the anniversary each year of the fall of Singapore, the 15th of February, there was a special service to the relatives of prisoners of war who were waiting to hear about their folk. And so at this point, you hear something of the pastoral side of Mowll. He talks on one occasion, while many have received news of the POWs, there are also many who have heard nothing. I met one mother who had lost both husband and son in the war and who had not yet had news of her only surviving son, who she hoped might be a prisoner of the war in the Japanese hands, prisoner of war in Japanese hands. And so you can see he not only involved himself in the services, he mingled with those who were basically hoping and waiting to hear more. As well as that, he realised there was a need for some of the clergy of the diocese to leave their parish duties and enlist as chaplains for the duration of the war. And he wrote, therefore, that with the calling up of men to enlist, special chaplains must be provided, and I am inviting clergymen between the ages of 30 and 40 who are physically fit to offer for this service. Now, Graham Dalbridge did not get accepted, but many did. In fact, we know by 1942 there were 29 full-time and 12 part-time. And a greater number of the chaplains served with either the Australian Imperial Force, that is the force that went overseas, or the Australian Military Force, which would later fight in New Guinea, with a few serving with both the RAF and the Royal Australian Navy. And he recognised the problem that encouraging clergy to enlist as chaplains would cause for the diocese. There would not be sufficient men for the parishes. And so in October 1939, he put out this call. In view of the extra calls which must come to many of them, I hope lay members of the several congregations will be as helpful as they can be in helping in the work of the parishes in whatever way is possible. Other things he interested himself in, as Ruth has indicated, he was thinking not only of what the war effort, he was thinking of other things. He was thinking of youth ministry. His desire for mission is evident during the war years as you read his pastoral letters. And of course, he's thinking of war planning, or post-war planning. In fact, he sets up a financial model to establish new churches in new parishes. And by 1944, he can say 17 of these have been done. So it's interesting to see his energy in thinking not only of the war, but of other things that need to continue on. Most people will say to me, but of course, you've got to talk about Seneth. And I'm going to do that now before I look at post-war and his post-war planning, but also what he was thinking about. At the outbreak of the war, the Archbishop proposed to establish an emergency fund to support the diocese's efforts in caring for service personnel. And thus, the Church of England National Emergency Fund, Seneth, was created. This was its purpose. It was brought, he said, into being for the purpose of assisting chaplains in ministering to the material and spiritual needs of servicemen in the military and Air Force camps of the diocese and in catering for those on leave in Sydney. It was a mammoth undertaking and needed both money and significant numbers of volunteers to make it work. A women's auxiliary, the Sydney Diocesan Church Women's Association, SDCA, was established to raise funds, to source items, and to provide voluntary help to staff the canteens, recreation rooms and hostels. and the head of SDCA was Mrs. Mowll. This was a joint enterprise, very much her putting in the hard yards that were needed. And by war's end, the SDCA had almost 8,000 enrolled members, and there were 125 parishes that had SDCA branches. You start to realise the extent of the work that Senef and SDCA had. How was it funded? Well, it's interesting to read the diocesan magazines, because from about 1940 onwards, you start to get a list of those who had made contributions. Parishes, individuals, other donors, and indeed service personnel who were so delighted by what they had received through Senef and SDCA that they themselves made donations. And in a sense, it became almost self-funding in terms of the amount of money received. By 1940, the Archbishop noted that there were now 94 branches of the SDCA in parishes, and there were 6 huts erected in various military camps and in the grounds of Sanandra's Cathedral, and more huts were planned. Okay, now I'll turn to the slides now, because this will give you an idea of the extent. Okay, this is 1940. There you can see the middle picture, the huts, the famous huts at the front of the George Street side of the cathedral. And above that, to my side, is the kitchens and women working in that. And you'll see down there handing out at the bottom there, and also again at the St Andrew's Hut canteen. Again 1940, and here we have in the top one the Walgrove Hut, which is out at Walgrove, the outside of Sydney. Then we've got the Richmond Hut, the Air Force Base at Richmond, the Ingleburn Hut, and then down below the St Andrew's Recreation Room, and also the Reading Room. And you start to realise the extent of this, not just talking the cathedral. We're talking about all sorts of different places where there were military camps of any sort. And I'm going to show you some of the stats in a moment, and you'll start to realise the extent of it. It is incredible when you see the extent of it. This is the Servicemen's Hostel again at the cathedral, the top one. And below that we have the Narellan Hut, and below that the Club for Nurses. And this club is basically at the cathedral. Some of the nurses, some of the women were had sleeping accommodation in the lower chapter house, and so on. Okay, the Senef Club at King's Cross, in what was the old Woolworths building in Darlinghurst Road. And again, this did not have accommodation, but basically it had enormous capacity for meals and for providing comforts for those there. And the hostel for women, the bottom one, of the auxiliary services, again in the lower chapter house, that one. And then finally, this one, the St Andrew's Officers' Hut. Okay, again to give you an idea, all over the place. But this is what I find particularly interesting, just to give you that picture of the hut outside. It's hard to imagine that, isn't it, outside the cathedral in George Street. But there you go. I'm going to show you something else, just to give you an idea. At the top we've got for the men of the forces, this is the number of meals and beds provided up to the 31st of January 1946. The St Andrew's huts, that's the ones at the cathedral, 3,078,322 meals, and 133,433 beds. Okay, and as you go down there, you realise there was a hostel at Redfern, 30,000, a hostel at St John's Glebe, 7,726, a hostel at Holy Trinity Millers Point, another 5,693. And that's for the enlisted men. We haven't got to the officers yet, and we certainly haven't got to the women. Now, all of these things had to be cared for by the SDCA members. They made the beds. They provided the meals. The logistical need of this was incredible. So jumping down, then you come to the officers. The cathedral officers' huts, there were 73,730 meals. At the hostel at St John's Milson Point, 3,845 beds. For the men and women of the services, 500,000 meals at the King's Cross Senef Club. And then below that, the nursing sisters, St Andrew's Place, 35,000 meals, 17,000 beds, women officers, so on and so on and so on and so on. The extent of it just blew my mind when I saw just how much was involved in terms of the efforts of Senef and SDCA. And interestingly, from about 1942 onwards, what you see in the Diocesan magazine are letters of thanks, of gratitude. And some of these, they usually go to the Archbishop, sometimes they'll go to Mrs. Mowll. But it's interesting, young men who are saying, I knew no one else in Sydney, and you provided a safe haven for me. Or women saying, I didn't know what to do, and you provided a place of refuge for me, and so on and so on. And I know that in the post-war years, those letters kept coming of their time when the ministry of the diocese that the Archbishop and his wife had basically overseen played such a significant role in terms of those who passed through, the service personnel who'd passed through. And I haven't talked about the other things that they did in terms of the other huts and other chaplaincy work, but the work of Seneth was great indeed. Now, as Ruth indicated, the work of Seneth went on beyond the war, but originally it was set up for the whole purpose of the war and that. What else to say before Mark pulls me off? When victory came, the news of victory came in Europe in May 1945, there was a special Thanksgiving service in the cathedral. And then on Victory in the Pacific Day, there was a civic service in the Domain. And the Archbishop himself spoke. He was the preacher. The Lord Mayor of Sydney asked him to speak. And I think this was a fitting way for him to be acknowledged for his service during the war years, for his energy, his creativeness, and his spiritual leadership. And he began his sermon by reminding those assembled that firstly they were to remember the goodness of God and the two great principles of the Christian faith, service to God and service to man. And he continued by listing those who then needed to be thanked under that. And he finished, we must not forget our thankfulness to what we owe to the men and women who, by continued devoted service, have secured for us a place among the nations and a name still in the world. To all those today, and particularly to those who made the supreme sacrifice, we tender our grateful thanks. So was Marcus Sloane right? Were Cable and Judd right? I think they were. I think as I've looked at the materials in those war years, we do see Mowll at his best in terms of his creativity, his organisational ability, his ability to inspire, and his ability to actually provide spiritual leadership, particularly through prayer, but also through his ministry of the word.
So the question is about the Seneth building and funds left over. Okay.
I can't say with great certainty, but I believe there were funds at the end of the war. It's something I'm chasing up. I want to see what happens after the war. I haven't sort of got there yet, but I believe there were some funds available. What is interesting is the wide range of donations that came in. Large number of parishes were donating, as well as individuals and other donors and so on. And I don't think that stopped at the end of the war, and Mowll made it very clear that the work of Seneth was going to continue. Now, I don't know how successful the ongoing fundraising was, but it seems to have gone on. And as Ruth indicated earlier, he was a great fundraiser. He seemed to have the ability to twist people's arms in all sorts of directions.
The question is about when a rector went off to become a chaplain. What actually happened with the parish? Did someone else come in, or did they leave for a bit of time and with expectation? What happened?
And I'm going to have to take that question on notice. I honestly don't know.
The question is, did the war expand his ecumenical mindset? And what would that have looked like?
Theologically, no. But I think he was willing to work with others. Some years ago, I spoke at the Great Synagogue, and they wanted me to speak about Archbishop Mowll. And I said, why? And they said, he was a great friend of ours. And this occurred particularly through the 1940s into the 50s and beyond. And it does seem, looking at the documents that I've been able to find, that he certainly worked with other denominations. It wouldn't surprise me with the Cardinal Gilroy connection, because Gilroy himself was, let's say, less hard-faced towards Protestantism than some of the other previous archbishops had been, or cardinals had been, and was more willing to work. It didn't mean that they agreed theologically, but nevertheless, if there was a common need, they were prepared to do it. I don't know the extent of that. The ones that I tended to see tended to be ecumenical across the Protestant denominations.
Can I ask a question? I'll use my privilege of being up here with you. What would it practically look like? I mean, I know I was just thinking of, for instance, the Watson's Bay Parish, St Peter's, I think it is. If you're up there ministering to the naval base up there and the naval officers and so forth, what would have happened? What are the processes? Would people have just come down Would they have to notify them first that they're coming down, or would they just sort of turn up on the day? How long could they stay for? What could they do? What would it look like?
They could certainly turn up on the day. Meals are always provided, and the attitude was we will take any service personnel who come to us. So there are a number of ways. In terms of the beds, yes, they were limited, and they tended to be given to those who were passing through and had no other form of accommodation available to them. It's interesting, the letters that I tend to notice, particularly in the Dawson magazine, are often of people who are from the country, never been to Sydney before, they're on leave and they're not sure what to do, and they tend to be the ones who avail themselves of it. But it's interesting, at the bottom of that list, there's even a hut at Mascot at the aerodrome for those from the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force who were passing through, and they were cared for as well. So it's quite an extensive thing. But by and large, it was available to anyone who wanted the service.
It's an enormous operation. Thanks for opening that up to us. Very good.